Thank you very much for joining us right here on ET Now as we discuss and look forward to Q3 GDP. And it is, of course, a much awaited exercise, given this is going to be the first figure out post demonetization, the second full year estimate, and one is wondering if it's going to be revised downwards. I request my flash and my ticker team to put that. Okay, that's the ET Now poll you have on your screens right now. And let's take it across to two very special guests who are joining us, Suvodeep and, of course, Mythili Bhusnurmath. Mythili, thanks very much for being with us. What's your quick take on what are the factors that is going to impact the Q3 GDP? It's such a crucial one because this is going to be the first impact after demonetization, and this really will tell how things stand as far as the entire fiscal year is concerned, because this is going to be the second advance estimate for FY17 as well.
Well, absolutely, because we really have no idea at all in terms of statistical accurate numbers, to the extent that you can get accurate numbers on such things, about how the demonetization has really impacted economic growth in the country. Remember, there has been a great deal of controversy about whether growth has come down, and if so, how much has growth been affected. So we already have seen the Reserve Bank of India lower its GDP estimates for the year. The CSO has not done that as yet, because when they released the first advance estimates in the early week of January, they had made it very clear that they had not taken the impact of demonetization into effect. So we really have to see what into the CSO's estimate, how much has GDP been impacted for the third quarter, as well as how do they see the year as a whole panning out. So a great deal of interest is dependent on these numbers. Because remember, it's not just the government and the RBI that have lowered their numbers. We've also seen the World Bank lower its GDP growth numbers for India. So there's a great deal of interest rests on these numbers. We'll have to see what the CSO unveils for us just minutes from now.
Indeed, just minutes from now. It's also good to have Anubhuti Sahay of Standard Chartered on ET Now with us, and so is Jayesh Mehta, Bank of America Merrill Lynch. But Suvodeep, you've been with us for a while, and let me ask you, I mean, the factors that Mythili spoke about, and add to those factors will perhaps be a revision of the fiscal year 16 GDP, which will add on to pressure, demonetization impact. What happens to the second advance estimates? What really happens to the entire year? What are the factors that you are really watching out for? Because empirical evidence does seem to suggest that whether it is manufacturing, consumer goods, construction, trade, all of those activities have indeed taken a hit.
So I think there are a couple of things to note here. One is when we are looking at the GDP estimates, it's mostly the formal sector estimates that will be flowing through in these estimates. The informal sector is still out of the ambit, and it comes in only, earliest is around January 31st, 2018. So from that perspective, I think it's important to note that these estimates will be a bit of an overestimate than what the true picture is. That's my sense on how the numbers should be read into. Having said that, I think these, today's release makes it important in terms of what to look at. Say, look at manufacturing, construction, real estate, retail trade, etc. What kind of numbers they print, and especially also, the balancing factor might come from the financial services, which might see an uptick. So I think it will be an interesting read in terms of how the formal portion of the economy has been faring, though I think it will be a bit overestimated than what the actual picture in terms of when you combine the informal sector would be.
Jayesh Mehta, you want to come in on that? Because a lot of people believe that this will still not be the right reading, given the informal, unorganized sector will not be taken into consideration so much, and that is the part which has really suffered, because that is where the cash crunch was most felt.
Yeah, I think, see, that's always been the case, right? So even when it was going was good, it was never part of these numbers, and we never used to therefore say the GDP is higher or so. And the impact of that will also come on formal sector if there is a deep penetrated impact on the informal sector, because then there is job loss and wage loss, which will also impact the formal sector. So to that extent, I would kind of not really bother much about it. It's a real number, and at the end of the day, what we look at these numbers for, right, is the policy matters and the stuff like that we look at this number. So purely looking at it, this number is the important number. Whether it includes the informal sector fully or partially doesn't matter.
Yes, we look at these numbers for policy, but we also look at these numbers for some status check on the economic activity all across the country. Anubhuti Sahay, you want to come in on that? Some of the factors that we spoke about and how exactly should this be impacting policy? I mean, if you look at the monetary policy, the RBI has already paused. In fact, it's changed its stance. So it can, in fact, it can even raise rates if the need arises and not just cut them. On the other hand, if you look at fiscal policy, the idea is that if commodity prices go up, inflation is going to inch up too, which we are seeing early signs of. So it's a tricky call as far as policy is concerned, but these numbers most awaited.
I think if you look at the policymakers' estimate on growth, or for that matter, even if you look at the estimates on GDP growth for next year from various houses, it's pretty clear that growth forecasts have been scaled down. At the same time, while RBI remains concerned about inflation, bigger concern in our view is emanating from global uncertainties. Let's not forget there are a lot of things which can go wrong on the global front in the next few months, and in our view one of the most important reasons, and probably the most important reason why RBI unexpectedly changed its stance from accommodative to neutral was this global uncertainty. If going forward, say 6 months or 9 months down the line, if things do not turn out to be as bad as it is feared as of now, then probably there can be a change. But given the growth inflation dynamics, given that we do expect some bit of uncertainty, we do expect rupee to weaken going forward, dollar to remain stronger, our sense is that despite low growth, low inflation trajectory for India in FY18, as far as rate cuts are concerned, rate trajectory is concerned, the rate cuts are behind us. Probably focus will be more on transmission rather than rate cuts. We expect RBI to remain on hold for the foreseeable future as of now.
On hold for the foreseeable future, but Mythili, I mean, I want to bring this to you because in our own estimates, at least the polls that we've done, Q3 fiscal year 17 estimated GDP is likely to be at about 6.1%. Of course, there are brokerages out there who've said it's going to be sub 6% as well. What's your own understanding? Because that number will determine what happens for the entire fiscal, given the year as so to say. And just to put it in perspective for our viewers here, Q1 GDP was 7.1%, Q2 was 7.3%, and the reason why we're talking about Q3 so much is exactly the period in which demonetization happened, and it did impact economic activity. So 7.1, 7.3, and then a level below 6% is going to pull down the entire GDP. And just for the benefit of our viewers, it's also important to point out that as per the CSO's first advance estimates, fiscal year 17 GDP could be 7.1%, but this did not include demonetization. The RBI has put that figure at 6.9%, IMF, World Bank 6.6%, the government and the economic survey has put that figure at 6.5%. So just to put things in perspective, that is where growth stands at. It's going to be important to see what the CSO has to say. But Mythili, what's your view? 6.1%, are we being overly pessimistic, or do you believe levels could actually be lower than that?
Well, it could be lower, but my sense would be somewhere around 6%, because even though growth has dipped, as Suvodeep said, it is a fact that the informal sector does not get fully reflected in these numbers. In fact, GDP numbers keep getting revised again and again as more data comes in, which is why we saw the GDP estimate for FY16 go up to 7.9%. If you remember, the earlier estimate was 7.6%. So the full impact will perhaps be only about a year later, which is a long time from now. But the immediate impact, to some extent, would be caught in these numbers, and I do expect it to be closer to around 6%. Sub 6%, of course, would be deeply damaging to sentiment. So I do hope it's somewhere around 6%, because that sounds so much more respectable. But anything less than 6% would be very, very damaging for sentiment, because even if GDP growth next year is going to improve, the fact is that we would have slipped very dramatically from 7.3 in the previous quarter.
Indeed, 7.3 in the previous quarter to levels of sub 6%. We'll of course have to wait and watch. It's interesting that the GDP data, which actually releases at by the clock 5:30 p.m. every evening, is not out till 5:41. We've invested 11 minutes of the time talking pre-GDP when the numbers are not out yet. Anubhuti, if I may throw this question to you, and I'm going to then take up the same with both Suvodeep and Jayesh. you know, if you actually look at the nominal GDP data, it was 11.9%, and that is what estimates were being built upon. You know, the first estimate of the GDP, advanced estimate that came in was on 11.9%. In the budget, it was 11%. If you just do the back calculations, in any case, it takes it down to 6.2%. So we're not looking for much respite there, are we?
Look, you know, couple of points there. First of all, if you look at the nominal GDP growth, and probably from my end, one of the best ways in which, or one of the most accurate ways, I think we can assess the impact of this whole remonetization exercise on economic momentum is to look at the whole nominal GDP growth number. And my sense is that probably we will again see nominal GDP growth in the December ending quarter slipping into the single digit after remaining in double digits for past 3 quarters. So that's you know, the first important point. But the second part is that once we move into the last quarter of FY17, that is the March ending quarter, we should again see it going back in double digits thanks to the you know, sharp increase in wholesale price index. Now, from the budget perspective, has the budget overestimated the nominal GDP growth? Of course, yes, we do think it is overestimation there. Probably the nominal GDP growth is likely to be in the range of 11.5% rather than 11.9%. My bias would be towards 11. But will it make a big difference to the fiscal deficit numbers, or for that matter market borrowings? Probably not. I mean, a little bit of difference in nominal GDP growth. So instead of say 11.9%, if it is say 11.5 or a little bit lower than that, it just makes a difference of 5,000 or 10,000 kind of a number from the GDP perspective. So from market borrowing perspective, fiscal deficit perspective, we are not overly concerned about nominal GDP turning out to be lower than what the budget has provided, unless it again slips back into the in single digit. That would be concerning, but as long as it remains between 11 to 11.5%, it shouldn't be too much of a worry.
Indeed, I do want to take up some more questions on demonetization and its impact, because it's a curious case where GDP numbers are not out for nearly 13 minutes now. But Suvodeep, if I may throw this to you, a lot of people believe that demonetization did not kill but delayed demand in that sense. The government and the RBI believe that remonetization is almost done. It's almost complete. Clearly then, that remonetization should help demand bounce back. Now, demand that has been delayed, when do you see that demand bouncing back?
See, I think when we are talking about demand being delayed and demand bouncing back, I think it's mostly to do with whatever demand had been postponed due to cash transactions not being a preferred option. So I think from that perspective, the demand pickup might not be very significant, very honestly, in my view, because if you're looking at the cash transaction, mostly if you're looking at the consumer staples, that is where most of the cash transaction at the retail end happens. That anyways would be, in a quarter or something, the recovery should be there. So from that perspective, I think, there is not much a huge demand that can come in, as the RBI is kind of looking at in terms of a huge surge that might come in. So I think, there might be some delayed demand, that delayed purchases that might come in, but I don't think that's a huge number as such. The cash remonetization has been kind of over, or will be over by March. And my sense is that first quarter of FY18 onwards, things should be normalized. And within that span, I don't think there is, or from first quarter onwards, I don't think there is much of pent-up demand that we'll suddenly see in the system. I don't think that's probably the way that it will happen. Fundamentals in terms of demand, etc., will continue as it was earlier. It's not that it's pent up and suddenly it will come into the system. Whatever pent up was there is only due to the cash transaction not being there, which should, over the last couple of months, should have already been in the system, I think.
So you don't believe that there's going to be this huge bounce back. Jayesh, do you share that view, and do you agree that it's all right to presume that remonetization has happened and it should ideally bounce back demand, but we're not going to see anything dramatic. We're not going to see anything spectacular happen because it's just the cash transactions that were impacted. That's the view coming in from Suvodeep.
We agree. Yeah, I completely agree. And most of that demand which really got killed were more perishable things and stuff like that. And that has no benefit or impact of delayed demand, right? So I think the delayed demand is what people are talking about is very, very nominal. Yes, I think maybe in November people did wait for it, but all that delayed demand did come in December, January. So there's nothing going to come new with remonetization coming back to normal.
All right.
Yes.
There's news that's breaking right now. I'm sorry. Okay, that's a very curious number there. Q3 fiscal year GDP at 7.1, actually 7% versus our own poll of 6.1%. So this is a spectacular number if you go by. I just have to see if they have taken demonetization and its impact at all. I'm just going to see that and come back to all of you. But Mythili, your first take on this. Q3 fiscal year 17 GDP still awaited. Is that 7% versus 7.2% year on year and versus 7.3 on a quarter basis. It's very interesting because many were expecting this number to be sub 6%. I still have to see if they have taken the second advance, this is called second advance, they have taken into account demonetization or not. But your quick take there.
Well, yes, presumably at least it's not the entire impact, as whatever could be captured in the numbers, they would have taken it into consideration. And if one can take it at face value, the numbers are certainly very heartening. And it comes as a boost in the arm for the Modi government because nobody expected it to be anywhere near 7%. So if these numbers do reflect the demonetization impact, to whatever extent the numbers do reflect those impacts, it certainly is very heartening for the government. For 7% for the third quarter, just shows a very small dip from 7.3 in the previous quarter. And if we think that Q4 of the next fiscal is going to show a further improvement, this does suggest that the economy is on the mend. But I would take these numbers with a pinch of salt at the moment, Supriya.
All right. I'm just going to give figures because these figures are coming out as we speak. Manufacturing is at 8.3%, and I think fiscal year 17, the entire growth will be seen at 7.1%. So you're right, this is a very, very heartening data as far as the government is concerned. Anubhuti, your quick take on this, 7.1% fiscal year 17 GDP. The second GDP advance estimate also unchanged. So that's part one. And part two, during the acute phase of demonetization, it looks like we didn't do too badly. 7.7% actually for the third quarter.
Okay, if I have got it correctly, it is 7% for the third quarter as well as the full year.
%7 for the third quarter and 7.1% for the full year.
Okay, so for as far as the third quarter is concerned, we were looking at a growth number of 6.6% for GDP. So while we were far above the consensus, the 7% number comes as a surprise to our most optimistic forecast too. I think there are a few factors which probably turned out to be better than our expectation. Those factors were very strong if you looked at the December ending quarter number. So the first is obviously if you look at the sales tax growth. If you look at the sales tax growth of the 11 states, April to December, it grew at 11%, cumulative number, versus 9%, which was the growth in September. So sales tax growth, which is used as a proxy for putting the number for trade in GDP, that was very, very strong. So we are not surprised on that. I think the other support would have probably come from strong numbers in public administrative services. Government expenditure after netting out interest payments and subsidies grew more than 30% in this particular quarter. We estimated for it at a more conservative basis, but I think this is yet another area where probably we saw an upside surprise. The third factor where probably we could have seen an upside surprise is on the agriculture sector. We did expect an improvement, but my sense is that probably this is another area where we have seen sharper than expected growth, and which would have in turn lent support to the headline GDP number. Clearly, it shows that the impact of this demonetization or remonetization has not been as bad as it was initially feared, but my sense is that once this number gets revised, probably we can see some downside revisions. Our own full year forecast for FY17 is at 6.8%, not very far away from 7.1%, which CSO has provided, but as we move further down, probably we can see some downside revision. One thing which I would just like to highlight here is that while most of the market expects the March ending growth number for GDP to improve vis-a-vis December, there is an unfavorable base effect at play. So probably the March quarter growth rate for GDP might not turn out to be higher than 7%. We do expect it to be lower than the third quarter, and probably that can bring down the full year number lower.
Your thoughts there? I'm sorry I'm cutting you short on this one, but we do have TC Anant, India's chief statistician, talking to media and explaining the numbers for the third quarter and also his second advanced estimate for fiscal year 17. These numbers are indeed surprising, but it's a pleasant surprise indeed.
Advanced estimate and the second advanced estimate, as well as the third quarter estimates which have come in. After that, I can respond to questions for a while. Briefly, the main point is, as far as overall GDP is concerned, we estimate this at the stage of the second advance, which is the same as the first advance, which is at 7.1. The reasons for this are detailed in the press note sectorally. You will observe that in some segments the growth rate has gone up. In other segments, as compared to the first advance, the growth rate is lower. Principally in agriculture, mining, manufacturing, we show a higher growth rate in the second advance than we did in the first advance. The major reasons for this is that in agriculture, this advance estimates, second advance estimates of agriculture, which were released by the Ministry of Agriculture, now show a much higher level of agricultural growth than they had shown earlier. They are projecting a 9.9% growth for Kharif crops as against 8.9% earlier. In mining and quarrying, IIP for the period April to December is registering a growth of 0.9% as compared to a negative 0.2% which was available in April to October, which was used by us at the time of the first advance. Similarly, in manufacturing, April to December shows in a growth of 0.5% as against a negative 1% which was available at the time of April to October. These are some of the reasons why the second advance estimate has come in these segments as higher. Correspondingly, if you look, you will find that in certain segments, particularly in financial insurance, real estate, the second advance comes in lower than the first advance. In public administration and defense, also the second advance comes in lower. The reasons here have to do with principally in financial real estate, insurance real estate, principally on account of the advance filing of companies which were made available. The third quarter estimates of companies which fall into this segment showed a lower growth than what was available in the first two quarters. In public administration and defense, the reason is actually quite mundane. Government revenue expenditure in the third quarter was squeezed, and that was available in the budget documents. Overall, GVA has come in a little lower than what we had predicted at the time of the first advance. It is now being projected at 6.7%. But the reason why GDP has maintained is the reduction in GVA has been compensated for by improved estimate in net indirect taxes, both on account of an increase in indirect taxes over April to December as against April to November, and in subsidies which come in much lower this year, principally on account of the fact that at the time of the first advance, we were still working with budget estimates of subsidies. as you have seen the budget documents, now the revised estimates of subsidies are available, and they show a much tighter compression than was provided for in the budget estimates. Both of these show a negative, since the subsidies show a negative growth and taxes show a significant positive growth, the GDP growth has been maintained. Inter alia, these numbers are shown in the third quarter estimates as well. The third quarter estimates have come in at 6.6% for the third quarter. One point which I would like to emphasize, and then I'll close my initial statements and take comments from the press. These estimates are based on the revised estimates for 15-16 which were released at the end of January, as against the first advance estimate which was benchmarked to the provisional estimate. Now, those of you who have compared the provisional estimate to the revised estimate would note that unlike the first 2 years of the new series, this time the revised estimate has come in higher than the provisional. So in fact, last year's base has gone up. So the growth numbers which we are showing now on the quarterly estimates as well as at the advance estimates are benchmarked to a higher base, and that may be kept in mind when you are interpreting the results. Last observation is, many of you have already drawn some inferences about this estimate based on the data available from IIP, Agricultural Advance Estimate, as well as corporate filings. And these estimates are in line with that. The details of corporate estimates, etc., are given in our press note, and you may wish to make use of it in your write-up. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Secretary Sir. Yeah, let's start with 299. Yes.
So Shubham from Cogensis. So you've been able to maintain the number at 7.1 in the second estimate itself. The manufacturing mining is in fact been revised higher. Are we to make that the impact of demonetization is still not captured in the numbers?
You know, I don't know what you mean by not captured, or let me put it this way.
So because the manufacturing shows a jump again, and those are the particular sectors which were likely to have an impact of the currency withdrawal, that's why.
Well, I can only tell you what the third quarter figures show. We have the third quarter figures on, at the moment, let us see what have we got. We've got the IIP figure, complete figure for the third quarter. Those numbers have been released to you. They have been used in this estimate. We also have, at this stage, only advance filings of corporates. Those figures are also available to you. We have used them in the third quarter estimates. Are there more numbers which are likely to come in the future? The answer is yes. More numbers will be coming in the future, and in particular, the full corporate filing data will not be available until the close of the financial year, and we will get to see it at the time of the revised estimate, which is published at next January in 2018. We will also get to see the annual survey of industries data for this period, which will become available only in January 2019. But as of now, the data which is available has been captured in these estimates, and you may interpret them in whichever way you like.
Yeah, Sapna.
So, Sapna from CNBC TV 18. So, two aspects here. One, of course, 7.1 has been a bit of a surprise for many quarters. You also have more numbers coming in on 31st May. So, but overall, the trajectory is looking very positive. Does it really indicate that this is how it's going to continue? Because you also benchmarked against a higher base for 15-16. That is one. And second, do we understand that demonetization has really not had the kind of impact that a lot of quarters were expecting? So, your thoughts?
You know, I told you this last time also. Policies like demonetization are very difficult to assess without a lot of data coming in. But the immediate effect, based on the data which is currently available, certainly bears out the observation which you have made. We will, of course, keep evaluating our numbers as and when more data becomes available, and it will be my job to make the data available to you, and you will draw the appropriate conclusions at that time.
But no demand impact as of now.
I will not draw any conclusions.
Sir, this is Gaurang from ET now. I just want to particularly ask you about the third quarter data, where we've seen, the growth being significantly lower than the first two quarters. If you could perhaps tell us about what factors have dragged this particular number down in the third quarter, and where is the impact, particularly if you compare to the previous quarters, of the demonetization most visible?
Again, from my reading of the third quarter numbers is that in the third quarter we find that sectorally agriculture and mining do better than in the first two quarters. In so far as manufacturing is concerned, the number is mixed. It is better than the second quarter but not better than the first quarter. Trade, hotels and restaurants again is better than the second quarter, not as good as the first quarter. Each one of them, the underlying data points are described in the database. The only sector where the third quarter is distinctly worse, or only two sectors where the third quarter is distinctly worse. One is the finance real estate category. Now, here there are two reasons. One, as I said, the corporate filings. On a marginal level on finance, the other element is finance is estimated by us, financial services, by growths in credit and deposits. Here we find a mixed picture. While deposit growth was good over the year, the aggregate of deposits and credits, when you compare it to previous years, is
Mythili, I'm going to take this to you because you, like me, will be a skeptic with these numbers. How credible is this data really? Because what has left lingering in my mind is the fact that TC Anand says revised estimates will be available by January 2018 and I will keep getting you data when it happens. Is he telling us that when he gave out the first advance estimates and did not include the impact of demonetization, that number stays the same even with its impact? Are you telling me Indian economy did not suffer at all on account of the cash crunch? I mean, empirical evidence is obviously in complete contrast to what this data seems to say at this stage.
Well, absolutely. But as he himself said, it is going to be very difficult to assess. And when people asked him, some of the media persons asked him, what conclusion to draw, he said, I will not draw any conclusions, because the fact is this is the problem with statistics. Because mining, manufacturing and agriculture have gone up, whereas real estate and public administration has come down. So there have been these adjustments, and going forward we might see still further adjustments. Because take something like manufacturing, which shows a pretty strong growth of, say, 8.3% is what the CSO numbers say. But as we've seen from IIP, and there has been this disconnect year after year, quarter after quarter in the IIP and CSO numbers. What we saw from IIP is that in the first 3 quarters of the year, there was a growth of just 0.3%, whereas the IIP third quarter gives you a number of 8.3%. So clearly there are a number of questions which remain unanswered in these numbers. And as TC Anand himself very clearly said, and I reiterate this, he says it's going to be very difficult to assess, because to say that something as important and as significant as demonetization has left the GDP number completely unchanged is really very difficult to swallow. So this really is the problem with the data. We have to wait and see, read through the internals, read through notes. As Anand himself has said, there are certain qualifications, certain caveats which have to be read into these numbers. But certainly it would be naive to assume that demonetization has not impacted the economy, and that is what a superficial reading of these numbers would seem to suggest.
That's exactly my point. If you look at these numbers superficially, they tell you that we are absolutely in the pink of health, whether we demonetized or we did not. And Dr. Rajiv Kumar, you're a candid speaker. Let me pose that question to you. I'm not questioning the credibility of this data. I'm sure this data is credible. But what I am questioning is that are we here presuming, and are these numbers telling us here that there was no impact on India's economic activity because of demonetization? Isn't that too naive a presumption to make?
Well, I have been maintaining for some time, Supriya, that the demonetization could actually have in some sense a perverse impact with the greater formalization of the informal sector. And as the sales tax data tells you, and also the excise duties collection and the personal income and the personal income tax, all these have been much higher. I think one of the reason is that there has been an expansion of the formal sector, and therefore a much bigger catch, as it were. The base has gone up because of this effect. So while the real economic activity in some sectors would have been surely affected, it has been compensated in the official statistics by a greater catchment of these statistics, in the GDP data. That's one point. The second point is, that the growth in agricultural sector and manufacturing sector has been quite significant. And while and the agriculture sector is what 6.6% for FY17, and the manufacturing is 8.3, is the same old story that Mythili was also repeating, which is that somehow the IIP, which is a volume index, and the manufacturing, what CSO releases is a value number, which is not based on a much larger database, etc. That disconnect continues, but the fact is that we have been using this series, this manufacturing GVA, for the last so many quarters, and to that extent it's very clear that demonetization, the impact of demonetization, if at all, would be seen in the latter quarters, perhaps because maybe the inventory or the production or the orders were just all in place and therefore continued, but will now, I suppose, with the demand going down, there's a lag. Basically, I'm saying that demonetization, the impact would show up with a lag, but quite clearly, all the Cassandras that have been talking about a drop of 2% and 1.5%, etc., have been proven completely wrong, because it does seem that the economy has taken demonetization in his stride, and the formalization of the economy, which is good in the longer run, has helped the official statistics.
Much that I would like to agree with you, I am a journalist and I'm supposed to be skeptic. I'm paid to do that, Dr. Kumar. I'm going to take on the point that you mentioned, that maybe inventories were such that they got taken care of and demonetization happened, but perhaps with a lag effect. If that were to be true, if there were to be a lag effect, what sort of an impact do you assess on Q4 GDP numbers? In a moment from now, we will have Shaktikanta Das, the Department of Economic Affairs Secretary, also talking. But very quickly, before he starts speaking, actually he is going to talk, so maybe we should just go across to him. And I do want to keep that line going with Dr. Rajiv Kumar and carry on with that conversation. Okay, that's Shaktikanta Das speaking. Let's go across to him.
As you have seen, the numbers completely negate the kind of negative projections and speculations which were made about the impact of demonetization. One thing that comes across very clearly is that we still maintain our growth rate at 7% and 7% plus. As you know, for the Q3, the GDP number has been given at 7%, and for the full year, it is 7.1%. Whereas most of the earlier projections which were being made by various sections and by various quarters were projecting a GDP growth for this year, and particularly for Q3, at much lower levels. So therefore, one has to see the entire playing out of the demonetization exercise which were undertaken by the government in this particular background, and it's very satisfying to note that the process of remonetization has also progressed well, and as they say, it is near complete today. So therefore, and what is important to note is that agriculture sector has shown very robust growth at 6% against 4.68%, which was the projection earlier. Manufacturing sector growth at 8.3% is again very, very satisfying, because there were reports and we had said that most of the reports were anecdotal, not based on statistics. There were reports that manufacturing activity in many sectors were affected during the demonetization, but as we see from the numbers, manufacturing sector growth at 8.3% is very satisfying, and it's a very promising number. And also, I must mention here that the report, if you go through the projections, the tax collections also have improved significantly. Mining sector has done well. So if you see agriculture, manufacturing, mining, these are the, the underlying these are the substantive sectors of any economy, and when they are doing well, I think this is very important. This is very satisfying to note that, and particularly in the background of the fact, you will recall, many of you were present today morning when OECD report released its economic survey. Earlier, the IMF had been, IMF had been describing India as a bright spot in a global gloomy global economy, and today morning the OECD, the Secretary General, described India as a star performer when it comes to reforms, and the OECD report has listed out the series of reforms which have been undertaken by the government. So therefore, the structural changes which India is undergoing now, thanks to demonetization, again with GST coming up, and the series of reforms which government has undertaken, they look very, very promising. One point which I would like to mention, which I anticipate this question from you, so I would rather preempt that question and answer, is that the real estate sector has apparently not done so well, and it's not a very satisfactory number. There we have to remember that the real estate sector itself is going a kind of a major structural reform. A major structural correction is taking place in the real estate sector, especially with the passing of the law on the Real Estate Regulatory Authority. The Act is now in place. There will be a regulation in place. There will be a regulatory authority in place for real estate sector, and the entire regulatory mechanism now provides greater quantum of consumer protection. The interest of consumers, the individuals and families who spend their hard-earned money to acquire a house, I think their interest has been taken care of in the new bill, in the new law. So the entire sector is going through a process of structural reform. A major structural shift is taking place in the real estate sector. So therefore, I think perhaps it has had some effect in slightly dampening the growth in real estate sector. But I think going forward, we should see improvements to come. Last point I would like to mention, as far as I have seen from the report in the short time that has been available, I think the revised estimate numbers of last year have been adopted as the base for projecting the GDP numbers for 16-17. Now, as you will recall, the revised estimate, GDP revised estimate figures of last year were revised upwards. They were revised upwards significantly. So on a higher base, to record 7% growth in Q3 and to expect 7.1% is definitely something very noteworthy. The OECD itself has also mentioned that in a gloomy global scenario, when a country is consistently recording 7% plus growth, it is something definitely which is noteworthy and should be taken.
Shaktikanta Das almost sounds like a man who stands vindicated at the end of a very, very troublesome game. But Dr. Rajiv Kumar, we had that conversation going. And if you look at the commentary that's also coming in from North Block, they seem to be in a very celebratory mode. But are you telling me, sir, and I'm going to go back to my question, that other than the impact that was negative on real estate and financial services, there has been no impact at all? I mean, there have been job losses, and empirical evidence seems to suggest that. There has been a delay in demand. Empirical evidence seems to suggest that. Across the line, if you see, manufacturing did take a toll. These numbers tell us otherwise, and you have got to wait up until January of 2018 to find out how real and significant this data really is, because that is when the revised estimates will come in.
And Supriya, I'm not sure whether we'll get anything different in January 2018. And here I must, sort of in some sense, prick the very celebratory balloon that the government officials have been, have been floating, and which is that there is, of course, and has been since ever the new series came out, a fairly strong disconnect between the official statistics and the real economic activity on the ground. And that's to me, I'm saying this with all care, because that very often tends to hide and create a sense of complacency when none is needed because of what you just mentioned about the job losses. Now, what I'm saying is two things. One, that clearly the official GDP statistics and numbers have to be somehow corrected to reflect the ground realities, which are there, and this has been going on for, I think since January of 2014, and I think it's time that this government and the CSO takes care and publishes the previous series, etc., etc., and that has to be done. But the second point is very clearly that all of those people who are expecting a nosedive and a spiraling and the economy spiraling into a recession of unending longevity have been proved wrong. I'm effectively saying that demonetization has not had more than a fleeting impact, simply because some major sectors like agriculture and manufacturing have not been affected thus far. Manufacturing could show some lagged effects, and I've been talking to the industry people, and they say that order books are not as good as they were in the past, but surely agriculture and services, and in going forward also the financial sector, will perhaps pick up and take over the lag in manufacturing. So the monetization has surely not been as bad a negative impact as people have tended to make out.
Well, absolutely, and I think as far as agriculture is concerned, it's a stunning piece of evidence there. 6% growth for agriculture, we were estimating it at 4.8% in the first advanced estimates. But do hold your thoughts there, Dr. Kumar, because I do want to have many more conversations with you on this. I'll take it to Jayesh Mehta. And Jayesh, while demonetization has not impacted us and the economy has taken demonetization into its stride, and you did smile when I was talking about being a skeptical journalist, if remonetization is nearly complete, like the Department of Economic Affairs Secretary is saying, then we should really be in the pink of health on Q4 numbers, and 7.1% for the rest of for this entire financial year could even be higher.
No, absolutely. So one is were we expecting more than 7% for third quarter, maybe, and therefore demonetization has impacted only to an extent. But as Mr. Kumar said, a lot of things has actually moved from informal to formal sector. Right, so that and that's where we have to look at it. If you look at taken it from the tax collection and other data, definitely this is going to show up a much markup. Even if you look at empirical evidence or anecdotal evidence of retailers, because there was no cash. Organized retail saw a huge increase to almost that's what the industry figure talks about, to 65 to 75% into card, and now of course it's back to 35%. So a lot of the cash purchase which was happening is now actually getting accumulated into the data and stuff like that. And of course agriculture has been good because if we compare with the last 2 years earlier, it's been always it's a drought year. But yes, I would still say that if we say that there's no impact of demonetization, that's then staying in a world of whatever we can say. But it would not be correct to say. But you will be in illusion if there is no impact of demonetization.
So a small little bubble that needs to be pricked each time we speak about GDP. But Dr. Kumar, I'm going to take this to the Economist in you, and I'm going to then take it to the other economists as well. In its February monetary policy, the RBI held ground, paused and said, they've changed their stance more than anything else, which means that RBI can both reduce and hike rates if the need does arise. And it looks like the RBI is in mood to actually hike rates and not reduce them. What does this data do for that rate hike? What does that data do to the, the rate cycle, so to say? Because this is data that's pointing out that we're in the pink of health. During demonetization, we did 7%, and with remonetization being nearly complete, we should be in robust numbers for the fourth quarter and much higher than 7.1 that they're projecting for the entire fiscal.
So, Supriya, this is where actually the problem is. Because unfortunately, and I'm having to repeat this, the data since the launch of the new series does not seem to reflect the reality on the ground. And this is where RBI, you remember Raghuram Rajan, and also I think Urjit Patel, both had earlier in this past said that the data that released by CSO does not reflect the reality. So to that extent, it makes policy making very difficult. Because just as you are saying that if we are in the pink of health, then the RBI should be inclined to try and control demand and therefore not let rates rise, etc. But that would be enormously wrong at this point of time. When I know and that private corporate investment is in negative territories, commercial offtake of commercial bank credit is negative again to the industry. We know that there is demand deficiency, there is excess capacity in the economy, and there is job losses and certainly not job creation, which is what we need. So what I insist and I hope the government would do is to correct this discrepancy, and correct it by publishing, as I said, the back series, so that we know what the 7% means in terms of the earlier series. Because if, for example, the 7% means that the period between 2003 to 2011 was a growth rate of 10%, then we know that we have come down 3%. Or we should say that this is closer to 5 or 4. Now, so this is where I would hope that RBI would not take these things, take this data, will take this data with its own correction, internal correction that I think they do, that they make quite often, and will hold their hand in anything to do with the, with the rate of interest at this point of time. Rather than that, they should be taking steps to further improve the transmission mechanism, so that the excess liquidity that the banks have at the moment is passed on to the borrowers through lower rates, which is what the bank should be doing at this point of time.
Indeed, I want to take this both to Suvodeep and to Anubhuti, but do hold your thoughts there, Dr. Kumar, because I will keep coming back to you, and there are some very important points that you've raised, that the RBI cannot be swept by this data and they should do the internal calculations, because if good growth is a ground to hold rates, this is perhaps not good enough, because this is data that does not reflect reality on the ground. Suvodeep, which side of this entire debate are you on? When there are figures that come in from the government, should the RBI endorse those figures, base its policy on that, or actually ignore the growth numbers because they point otherwise, and they perhaps point to the fact that the RBI either needs to hold rates, go ahead and curb demand, or actually raise them?
See, if I'm not mistaken, I think the FY17 numbers that have been put out in terms of the revised estimate on the GVA side is around 6.7%. We have to note that the RBI comes up with its estimate on the GVA side, which is close to around 7% that they are talking about. So I think if anything, this is on a GVA front in line or slightly lower than what the RBI was estimating. Having said that, I think obviously, and it's well established now, that we have to take these numbers with a pinch of salt. We cannot rely entirely on what at least on face value, what say numbers like manufacturing, etc. talk about. So I think we have to really pass through certain numbers. We have to take a judgment call, and I think the RBI internally does the same. So from that perspective, I think yes, they will take cognizance of what the growth numbers have been put out, but at the same time have their own thoughts and look at other metrics also. For example, capacity utilization, what kind of levels are they at, and whether they are coming back to indicate any kind of potential output or output gap kind of contracting. So I think there are a lot of other indicators that they would be looking at, and I think this is just one of the inputs in the whole policy framework as such. So yes, pinch of salt to be taken with this particular data release, and obviously from RBI's perspective, there are other indicators that they should be looking at before they really take a stance or change their stance or anything.
Mythili, you want to come in on that? As far as the RBI stance is concerned, that this data is not good enough. Don't go by growth numbers that the CSO is projecting. Do your own internal assessments and then decide on what your rate trajectory should be.
But this is what makes RBI policy making so difficult, because it's not just the present governor but the earlier one, and even Dr. Subbarao has talked about how difficult it is for the RBI to frame its policy based on numbers which are given by the CSO, which cannot be relied upon. Because remember, the RBI cannot do as detailed a study as the CSO, which is the official authority from the government, giving the growth numbers, giving the GDP numbers. So if you cannot rely on the CSO numbers, then how do you frame your policy? And if you look at the figures, Supriya, I was just going through the numbers, and it's really interesting, because if you look at the GDP numbers that the CSO has put out for the year as a whole, and what they have for the first 3 quarters, then it would suggest that Q4 numbers actually come down. The Q4 growth part, rather than improving the economy, looking up in Q4 actually seems to suggest that if that number of 7.1 for the year as a whole is to be believed, and the numbers that you have for the first 3 quarters, because the CSO, mind you, has revised the numbers for the first and second quarter, because as against 7.1 and 7.3, you now have 7.2 and 7.4. So going by these numbers, it would suggest that Q4 actually falls to 6.8%. So there are a number of contradictions in the CSO numbers. Likewise, gross fixed capital formation in Q3 seems to have gone up from 3.2 to 3.5. Now remember, this is the quarter in which we had the impact of demonetization. Now to think that gross fixed capital formation could have actually gone up in that quarter, it really defies, any kind of sensibilities of people, any informed judgment. So it is really very difficult to comprehend on what basis these numbers have been derived. At the same time, in the absence of any other numbers, policy authorities will have to rely on these numbers. And if you remember what Satyakanta Das was talking about, the Cassandros of doom and all the rest of it, government's own CEA had suggested 6.5, and the government itself was pretty gloomy about GDP growth in this particular fiscal. So it's not just Cassandra's. Government was also a party to that. So I think we need to take these numbers with a big pinch of salt, and that makes policy making very, very difficult. I don't envy the RBI governor or the MPC members in this particular scenario.
It's important that you say that, because I think Dr. Rajiv Kumar also did point out to that these numbers somehow also do not corroborate with reality on the ground. And he did raise the point about how with a lag effect this may reflect in Q4. But Dr. Kumar, I have a two-pronged question to you. Again, because you're someone who can take on the... Yes, sure, you can make a point, but I'm also going to club my question with that. Politically speaking, this number comes in the middle of elections. This is a political thumbs up for the government. Sure, go ahead.
Oh well, but let me first make the point about the RBI policy. RBI is now officially mandated, statutorily mandated to be inflation targeter, and here the agriculture growth numbers must surely influence their policy making. Which is what I'm trying to say, that with such a wonderful agricultural growth that has happened in FY17 and the Kharif crop sowing average area we now know has gone up, so that the Kharif crop coming in FY18 would be even better, they should expect a drop in food prices. And they should expect, therefore, a drop in wage inflation and therefore overall, retail inflation. And if that is what they should expect, and as Surjit Bhalla recently pointed out that the core inflation is also been going down, then RBI surely cannot raise rates in its next monetary policy meeting. So that's the first point that I wanted to make, that agriculture performance should be one of the things that RBI should be watching very carefully, because that is where the wage inflation, the wage good prices would be determined in the whole year going forward. On the political thumbs up, yes, of course, I think it is CSO has very nicely given government all the bragging rights that it needs at this point of time, and wonderful. But also the fact that I feel very vindicated against people like Arun Kumar, etc., who have been saying that demonetization would lead to an unending recession in the Indian economy. Certainly not, and I again point out to something, which is that even going forward, you might find that a greater formalization of the Indian economy may produce official statistics that will tell you that there is a once-off positive impact, and the growth numbers and revenue numbers, etc., look good, but that should not deflect us from taking policy steps to generate greater employment in the economy, because that's the key going forward.
That's precisely the point. A 7% or a 7.1% can't tell the government that all's good at home. and let's put up our feet and relax there. But the point that I was making was about political thumbs up, and you're right. I think the CSO gives them enough bragging rights, at least this evening, even though the government's own quarters, the budget and the economic survey project growth at much lower levels of 6.5%. But on that note, it's an absolute joy and pleasure to be talking to all of you. Do stay tuned to ET Now. There's plenty of news and analysis that follows. As far as the Q3 GDP is concerned, it hasn't nosedived as against expectations, and numbers stand at a robust 7% for Q3 and 7.1% for the entire financial year.
Find us on Facebook at facebook.com/ETNow and don't forget to click the like button. You can also follow us on Twitter at ETNowLive. To stay updated with all our programming, hit the subscribe button on our YouTube channel by logging on to youtube.com/user/ETNow.